after Captain Ibrahim Traore exposed the real reason why the West silenced Thomas Sankara, the new president of Ghana, John Mahama just joined him, and exposed how and why Nkwame Nkrumah was also silenced. So how did it really happen? Imagine a kid born in a tiny village called Nkroful, tucked away in what we now call Ghana. Back then it was still called the Gold Coast and ruled by the British. This kid, his name was Kwame Nkrumah, and he would grow up to shake the whole continent. No one really knows exactly when he was born because people didn't always write those things down. But Kwame figured it was probably a Saturday in September 1909. Saturday-born kids among the Akan people are often called Kwame, so that's how he got one of his many names. At birth, his dad named him Nwia Kofi. Later on, when he got baptized, he was called Francis. But eventually, everyone just called him Kwame. His dad, Kofi Ngonloma, was a goldsmith, a man who worked with gold, and he had more than one wife, which wasn't unusual in their culture. Kwame's mum, Elizabeth Nyaniba, sold goods in the market. Even though his dad had other kids, Kwame was her only child. Growing up in the Gold Coast wasn't exactly a walk in the park. The land was bursting with riches, gold, cocoa, and all sorts of valuable stuff, but the people who lived there didn't see much benefit. The British built roads, railways, and ports, but it was all designed to ship the wealth out of the country and into Britain's pockets. But young Kwame wasn't just watching all this happen. He was quietly taking notes. And one day, he'd use what he learned to fight back, not just for Ghana, but for all of Africa. If you are still watching this video, it means you love the fact that new African leaders are standing up for their countries. Let us know in the comments section below which African leader you love best. John Mahama of Ghana PR, Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Back in the day when the Gold Coast was still under British rule, a big shift was happening. Schools started popping up, especially along the coast, thanks to the push for Western education. And while not everyone went to school, a small group of book-smart folks began to rise up and make their mark. One of those kids, Kwame Nkrumah. His mum didn't play when it came to school. She was determined that her son would get an education. His dad agreed, so little Kwame was signed up at a local school run by Catholic missionaries. At first, he wasn't a fan. Waking up early, sitting in class, it just wasn't his thing. But slowly he got into it. Like, really into it. Before long, he was the kid who actually looked forward to school. He didn't just pass his classes, he crushed them. After finishing 8 years of elementary school, he stuck around as a student teacher. And he was so good at it, he got picked in 1926 to attend a fancy teacher training school called the Government Training College, which would later be known as Akimoto College in Accra. By 1930, he'd graduated and taken his first real job as a teacher in a Catholic primary school. A while later, he even taught at a seminary, where he got so serious about faith that he started thinking maybe he'd become a priest. But deep down, something else was calling him. He dreamed of travelling, learning more and seeing the world outside the Gold Coast. At first, he had his sights set on the UK, but as life would have it, he ended up in the United States instead, at a place called Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Now, Lincoln wasn't just any school. It was one of the first historically black universities in America, and it was packed with smart, passionate people who talked about big ideas like freedom, race, and justice. Being in that kind of environment lit a fire in Nkrumah. He didn't just sit through classes. He soaked everything in. He studied economics, sociology, religion, you name it. He ended up earning multiple degrees, including one in theology and another in economics and sociology. But life in the US wasn't all smooth sailing. Money was tight, and that little scholarship he had barely covered anything. So Kwame hustled. At one point, he started buying fish in bulk and selling them on a street corner in Harlem, hoping to scrape together some extra cash. Sometimes he made a profit. Other times, he lost money. Eventually, the fish gave him a terrible rash and he had to quit. Then came his next gig, working in a soap factory. Let's just say it wasn't exactly a dream job. By the early 1940s, Kwame Nkrumah had his head deep in books working on a PhD. But school wasn't the only thing grabbing his attention. Bigger ideas were calling. Ideas about freedom, justice, and shaking off the grip of colonial rule in Africa. He started hanging out with other African students who felt the same way. They weren't just talking about getting good grades. They were talking about changing the world. This tight-knit group called themselves the African Students Association, and guess who ended up as president? Yup, Nkrumah. He started reading everything he could about African pride and unity. Two names kept showing up in the books that fired him up: W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. Garvey spoke boldly about a united Africa rising up together. Du Bois championed the rights of black people everywhere. Nkrumah took those ideas to heart. They shaped how he saw the world and his role in it. By 1945, after a decade of hard living and learning in the US, he packed up and moved to London. The original plan? Study law and finish his PhD. But the moment he landed in Britain, politics came knocking again, louder than ever. London was full of young, ambitious activists from different corners of the empire: Nigeria, the Caribbean, Kenya, South Africa. They all shared a common dream: kicking colonialism to the curb. Nkrumah jumped right in, going to meetings, writing essays, giving speeches. He even hung out with communists. While he never officially joined the Communist Party, he was definitely in the mix. Funny enough, when he got arrested years later back in the Gold Coast, the British found a blank Communist Party membership card in his stuff. But if you really want to know when Nkrumah started to level up in the world of political activism, it was the moment he met George Padmore. Padmore wasn't just another protester. He was a big deal, a fearless Pan-African thinker who had once led a global network for black workers. Padmore believed in ending colonial rule, uniting African and Caribbean people, and fighting for justice worldwide. He saw something special in Nkrumah. The two would spend hours talking about the state of Africa and the fight ahead. Padmore didn't just talk, he brought Nkrumah into action. He made him one of the main organisers of a powerful event, the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England. That meeting wasn't your average get-together. It brought together people from all over: Liberia, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Nyasaland, Togoland. And big names like Jomo Kenyatta from Kenya and Peter Abrahams from South Africa showed up too. It was electric. The energy in the room was all about pushing for freedom and giving colonised people a real voice. That moment helped spark independence movements across Africa and beyond. And for Nkrumah, it was a game changer. His name started spreading far and wide. He wasn't just another student activist anymore. He was now shaking hands with global thinkers, people like Dr. Hastings Banda from Malawi, and even his old hero, W.E.B. Du Bois. While Kwame Nkrumah was still hustling in London, surviving on tea and bread in cheap cafes and dreaming big about Africa's future, something interesting was bubbling up back home in the Gold Coast. A group of well-educated, well-dressed lawyers and businessmen, guys who were used to wearing suits and shaking hands with the British, decided to start a political group. They called it the United Gold Coast Convention, or UGCC for short. Their goal? To get the British out and bring in self-rule. But they weren't exactly trying to storm the gates. Their motto was self-government in the shortest possible time, which sounded bold but also kind of vague. The group's unofficial frontman was J.B. Dankwa. He had impressive credentials, studied law in London, earned a doctorate, wrote books, and was on pretty good terms with the British. Basically, he was someone the colonial powers actually listened to. Meanwhile, in the chilly cafes of Camden Town, Nkrumah was scraping by. He'd put his law studies on hold, dedicating all his energy to political work. Most days he couldn't afford more than a cup of tea and a stale roll, but that didn't stop him from dreaming up ways to free Africa. So, when word came from the UGCC offering him a job as General Secretary, Nkrumah didn't say yes right away. In fact, at first he wasn't feeling it. To him, the UGCC looked like a club for fancy middle-class folks, not the kind of people who were ready to shake the system. He even said, "Why would I join a movement full of merchants and lawyers when my ideas are way more radical?" But after some back-and-forth messages from J.B. Dankwa and a few deep chats with his political buddies in London, Nkrumah agreed. He figured, if I join, I'll push my own strategy anyway, and if we clash, so be it. So in December 1947, Nkrumah packed his things, boarded a ship, and returned home to the Gold Coast, and from the moment he touched down, he hit the ground running. He didn't just sit behind a desk, he had a plan. Take the UGCC from a small circle of elites to a powerful movement that reached the grassroots, especially young people, workers, and everyday folks who were tired of being ignored. He wanted branches in every town. He wanted marches, protests, and boycotts. Not everyone in the UGCC agreed with this approach. Some thought it was too much, too fast. But Nkrumah wasn't backing down. He started touring the country, holding meetings and rallies. He talked with fire in his voice, using powerful slogans like, "We have the right to live as men," and "We prefer self-government with danger to peace without freedom." His words lit a fire under people. Then came 1948. The tension that had been building for years finally boiled over. Things were getting harder, prices were going up, people were struggling, and many felt like the colonial government just didn't care. The final straw came when a group of ex-soldiers, men who had fought in World War II, marched peacefully to deliver a petition about their conditions. Instead of listening, the colonial police opened fire. People were killed. That moment shattered whatever patience was left. Riots broke out. Cities burned with frustration. The British panicked and rounded up key leaders, including Nkrumah and 5 other UGCC members, later known as the Big Six. They were arrested and blamed for the unrest. Nkrumah didn't stay locked up for long, but the whole experience made one thing clear to him. The UGCC wasn't built for real change. Too slow, too cautious, too comfortable. So in 1949, he made a bold move. He broke away and started something of his own, a new political party built for the people, by the people. He called it the Convention People's Party, or CPP. By now, Kwame Nkrumah had practically worn down his shoes from travelling all over the country. He wasn't some distant politician in a fancy office. He was out there, walking the dusty roads, shaking hands, listening to stories, and speaking straight from the heart. People loved him for it, especially the younger crowd. They saw him as one of their own, someone who understood what it felt like to be pushed aside. His new party, the Convention People's Party, CPP for short, wasn't playing around. While others were saying self-government soon, Nkrumah came out swinging with a louder message. We want it now. No waiting, no delays, no excuses. He got to work like a man on a mission. He turned the CPP into a full-blown movement. There were youth clubs, catchy slogans, bold red flags waving at rallies, and newspapers that roasted the British like it was sport. Everywhere he went, he gave fiery speeches that felt more like pep talks for a revolution. He told people that freedom wasn't just a dream, it was around the corner, and life would be better the moment they grabbed it. And it wasn't just the students and jobless youth who were listening. Factory workers, office clerks, old soldiers, and even school teachers were tuning in. People were tired of waiting and ready for change. Even the market women, those powerful ladies who ran the hustle in every town square, stood behind him. They didn't just sell goods, they passed along news, rumours, and political messages like wildfire. And then there were the veranda boys, young men with no homes, sleeping on porches, living from one odd job to the next. They saw Nkrumah as a superhero in real life. He wasn't just talking about change, he was the change. Then came the moment Nkrumah really turned up the heat. He stood on stages and shouted that the British reform plans were a scam, a distraction to buy more time. He called for something he named positive action. And no, it didn't mean sitting quietly and writing polite letters. This was code for protests, boycotts, peaceful disobedience, and nationwide strikes. It was bold, it was loud, and it was very clear. The people had had enough. The British, they didn't take it lightly. They arrested Nkrumah, put him on trial, and locked him up for speaking out. 3 years in prison. That was the sentence. But instead of silencing him, the move backfired. Big time. His arrest made him even more popular. His name was everywhere. His face was printed on posters, on pamphlets, in shop windows. The CPP turned him into a legend. While he sat in jail, his party kept growing. By the end of 1950, they had completely outshined the UGCC, the party that once seemed unstoppable. People weren't just cheering for the CPP anymore, they were voting for it. In the country's first real election, held in February 1951, the CPP crushed it. Out of 38 seats up for grabs, they took 34. And guess who won in Accra by a massive landslide of over 22,000 votes? Yep, Kwame Nkrumah, from inside a jail cell. The message was loud and clear. The people had chosen their leader, and it wasn't even close. At that point, the British couldn't ignore it anymore. Sir Charles Arden Clarke, the colonial governor, knew what had to be done. He ordered Nkrumah's release and asked him to take charge. On February 12, 1951, Nkrumah walked out of prison and straight into power. He was given a new title, Leader of Government Business. Kind of like being a prime minister, but with limits. Still, it was history in the making. The Gold Coast now had its first African-led government. There was cheering in the streets, drums beating, people dancing in Accra. Nkrumah wasn't just back, he was back in charge. But even with all the fanfare, the British still held the keys to the big stuff. They kept control of the military, the money, foreign affairs, and legal matters. Nkrumah was leading, yes, but not without strings. Even after winning big in the elections, Nkrumah wasn't ready to take his foot off the gas. He kept pushing hard, telling the British loud and clear, "We want full independence, not later, now." Sure, the 1954 changes had given Ghana's leaders a bit more control, but to Nkrumah and his party, the CPP, it was like being handed the keys to a house but still needing permission to open the front door. That wasn't good enough. But not everyone agreed with Nkrumah's bold approach. Some leaders from smaller communities and ethnic groups were nervous. They worried that if Nkrumah got total control too fast, their voices would be drowned out in a one-size-fits-all government. They didn't want to be left behind while the CPP called all the shots. So they started forming their own groups. One of those groups was the National Liberation Movement, or NLM for short. It popped up in 1954, led mostly by folks from the Ashanti region, who had once been part of Nkrumah's party, but felt it was starting to ignore their needs. People like Baffour Akoto and J.B. Dankwa helped lead the charge, with support from K.A. Busia. These guys wanted a different setup, a federal system where different parts of the country could run some of their own affairs. They also wanted traditional chiefs to keep some power. The NLM didn't take over, but they weren't a small voice either. In the 1956 elections, they won 12 seats, making them the third biggest party behind the CPP and the Northern People's Party. Still, Nkrumah wasn't about to let that slow him down. He passed a law in 1957 that banned political parties formed around tribal or regional lines. That forced the NLM and others to join together into one new opposition group called the United Party. Meanwhile, British advisors were still debating what kind of government would work best, but in the end, they backed Nkrumah's vision for a united, centralised system. To settle the argument once and for all, the colonial governor dissolved Parliament and called for fresh elections. This was the test. Did the people truly want full independence? The results spoke for themselves. In July 1956, voters poured in. The CPP walked away with 57% of the votes. And because the opposition was scattered, Nkrumah's party won enough seats, especially in places like Asante and the Northern Territories, to hold a two-thirds majority in the 104-seat assembly. Nkrumah believed that anything less than a united government would only tear the country apart. A federal system, in his mind, was just a fancy way of saying, slow things down. He was convinced that all this back and forth was just a stall tactic from elites and the colonial powers who didn't want to let go. But now, with a clear majority in Parliament and public support behind him, the time had come. The British saw the writing on the wall and agreed. The Gold Coast would finally be free. So on March 6th, 1957, the world watched as history was made. The Gold Coast, now joined with British Togoland, became the brand new nation of Ghana, the very first black African country to break free from British colonial rule. As fireworks lit up the sky and crowds filled the streets, Nkrumah stepped forward and delivered a speech that would echo across the continent. He told the people, Ghana is free forever. But he didn't stop there. He said Ghana's freedom meant nothing unless the rest of Africa was free too. That night, he introduced something bigger than just a new country. He introduced a movement. Now in charge as Ghana's first Prime Minister, Nkrumah didn't waste any time. He launched a full-blown mission to build up the country. Not just with pride, but with progress. He had big dreams and even bigger plans. He focused on building things, roads, bridges, factories, and bringing electricity to more homes and businesses. One of his boldest projects was the Akosombo Dam, a massive hydroelectric project on the Volta River. It wasn't just about keeping the lights on. It was about powering new industries, especially aluminum production, which Ghana had plenty of resources for. But Nkrumah wasn't just thinking about factories and machines. He believed real freedom also meant giving people a chance to learn and grow. So he opened schools, colleges, and universities across the country. He made primary school free and made it easier for students to get into higher education. He wanted a smart, skilled population, not one that always had to rely on experts from overseas. Once Ghana became its own country, Nkrumah wanted to prove that independence wasn't just about waving flags and giving speeches. It had to show up in people's lives, especially in places like hospitals and schools. So he got to work. His government started building new health centres, clinics and schools all over the place. He made sure more doctors and nurses got trained. For the first time, people in smaller towns and villages started getting access to real healthcare, and it made a big difference. People were living longer and staying healthier. But Nkrumah didn't stop there. He had big dreams of turning Ghana into a strong, self-reliant country. He didn't want Ghana to only rely on cocoa, its main export. So he started building factories and state-owned businesses, everything from farming to mining to making goods right in Ghana, instead of importing them. The goal was simple: make more stuff, create more jobs, and grow the economy from the inside out. Unfortunately, some of those government-run businesses didn't go as planned. Many were badly managed, some were full of workers who didn't do much, and money was often spent the wrong way. Over time, these problems would come back to bite the economy. And while all of this was happening, Nkrumah himself started to change. In the early days, people saw him as a strong and inspiring leader. But as time passed, many felt he was becoming too controlling. Some even started calling him a dictator. By 1958, things took a serious turn. There were chiefs, especially in the Ashanti region, who didn't agree with his ideas, and they pushed back. Nkrumah responded by de-stooling some of them, which basically means stripping them of their titles. He also got really nervous about possible plots against him. One time, a member of parliament was caught bringing weapons into the country. That made Nkrumah feel even more threatened, like something dangerous was brewing behind the scenes. That's when he made a big decision, one that would change everything. He introduced something called the Preventive Detention Act. This law allowed the government to lock up anyone at any time without a trial. No judge, no hearing. Just straight to jail if the government saw you as a threat. Nkrumah said it was needed to keep the country stable. But for most Ghanaians, it felt like a nightmare. The law was used to go after anyone who spoke up against him. Political opponents, critics, even people who simply disagreed. No one was safe. One of the most heartbreaking cases was J.B. Dankwa, a respected politician who died in prison. Another opponent, K.A. Busia, ran off to England and stayed in exile for years. People were so afraid of being arrested that some opposition members actually joined Nkrumah's party just to stay out of trouble. Then, in 1960, Nkrumah made another big move. He pushed for a new constitution, one that would give him even more power. Ghana officially became a republic, and Nkrumah was now the first president. Under this new system, he could do almost anything: fire judges, dismiss army officers, overrule parliament, and pass laws without asking anyone. By 1961, somewhere between 400 and 2,000 people had already been locked up under his orders. And when workers organised a huge strike that same year to protest his economic policies, instead of listening, the government doubled down, granting itself even more emergency powers to shut things down. And then came another big issue: corruption. It started to show up everywhere. Government workers and party officials were flaunting their wealth, driving fancy cars, living in big houses. Some even had secret girlfriends living in apartments paid for with state money. Nkrumah wasn't happy about it. He called them out publicly, saying they were acting like greedy businessmen instead of leaders. To deal with it, he set up a committee to dig into their assets, checking bank accounts, house ownership, even how many cars they had. No one was off limits. If someone was caught with shady money or expensive gifts, Nkrumah gave them two options: quit your job or give it all back. Even though Nkrumah made a big show of fighting corruption in his party, the truth was, not much changed. A special committee had been set up to investigate shady deals and suspicious wealth among his inner circle. But their work went nowhere. Nothing was made public. No one faced real consequences. The flashy cars kept rolling, and the quiet payoffs didn't stop. While all this was going on, danger seemed to be closing in. Nkrumah's time in power wasn't just marked by speeches and development plans, it was also shadowed by plots and close calls. People were trying to kill him, and more than once they nearly succeeded. One of the scariest moments came in a small town called Kulungugu. Nkrumah was supposed to be at a ceremony, shaking hands, cutting ribbons, all that, but he ran a few minutes late. That tiny delay probably saved his life. A bomb exploded right where he would have been standing. After that, everything changed. Shaken and scared, Nkrumah all but disappeared from the public eye. For months it was like he vanished. No more casual strolls. No more cosy chats in village huts. No more riding around in taxis or wearing his signature kente cloth. He locked himself behind tight security, surrounded by only his most loyal supporters. The people noticed. That warm, approachable leader they once knew was slowly becoming someone else, someone distant. The court case that followed the Kulungugu bombing didn't go the way Nkrumah expected. The suspects were found not guilty. Furious, he fired the Chief Justice on the spot. Then he passed a new law that gave himself the final say over any court decision in the entire country. If a judge didn't agree with him, he could just overrule it. Simple as that. From that point on, it wasn't just his enemies who were afraid, it was everyone. Big public rallies faded away. In their place came carefully controlled TV and radio broadcasts that praised Nkrumah non-stop. Newspapers were flooded with articles painting him as a flawless hero. Day after day, it was the same story. Kwame Nkrumah, the great and fearless leader. But all that flattery started to blur the line between what was real and what wasn't. He was so surrounded by praise that it got harder and harder for him to hear the truth. When people complained or raised concerns, he dismissed them as puppets of foreign powers, tools of neo-colonialism sent to stir up trouble. Then came another attempt on his life, even more terrifying than the last. It was January 2nd, 1964, and Nkrumah was just walking toward his car at his home, Flagstaff House. Nothing seemed out of place, until a police officer named Seth Ametui jumped out with a gun and fired 5 shots. Every single one missed. Panicking, Ametui ran after Nkrumah, trying to hit him with the butt of the rifle. The president dashed toward the front of the house, the gunman hot on his heels. But just when it seemed like Nkrumah might be caught, he turned around, faced his attacker, and wrestled him to the ground. He walked away with nothing more than a bite on the cheek. But someone else wasn't so lucky. His personal bodyguard, Salifu Dagati, had been killed trying to protect him. After the chaos settled, Ametewi was arrested and later executed for the killing. In the days that followed, Nkrumah fired nearly the entire police leadership. The very people who were supposed to protect him were now viewed as suspects. That decision made him even more isolated and even more vulnerable. Then came the rumours. People whispered that foreign governments, especially the United States, were behind the attacks. Protesters in Ghana turned their anger toward the US embassy. Soon after, 4 American professors were kicked out of the University of Ghana. Nkrumah believed the CIA had a hand in everything, from the bombing attempts to the gunman at his home. He wasn't just guessing, he was convinced. Ever since his friend Patrice Lumumba had been murdered in the Congo, Nkrumah had grown increasingly wary of foreign powers. He believed his days were numbered, and that Western powers were waiting to take him out next. So, picture this. It's January 1964, and Ghana holds a nationwide vote. But this wasn't just any vote. It was about whether there should be only one political party allowed in the whole country. When the results came in, the answer was yes. Just like that, Ghana officially became a one-party state. With Nkrumah and his Convention People's Party, CPP, in full control. Nkrumah said this would help the country stay united. He believed that having too many parties could cause chaos, especially with so many different ethnic groups. He also thought outside powers might take advantage of these divisions and mess with Ghana's progress. While the politics back home were getting more intense, Nkrumah had his eyes set on something even bigger. All of Africa. He wasn't just thinking about Ghana's future. He was dreaming about the whole continent coming together as one big, strong family. He called it the United States of Africa. To him, unity was the only way Africa could protect its resources, stand up to pressure from the big Cold War powers, and take control of its own destiny. And Nkrumah wasn't just talking about it. He rolled up his sleeves and started training a new generation of young African activists, future leaders who would carry the torch across the continent. He wanted them to understand what true freedom looked like, not just from colonial rulers, but from neo-colonial tricks that could keep Africa dependent. Even his personal life reflected his big political dreams. Nkrumah's marriage to Fathia Rizk, an Egyptian woman he had never even met before the wedding, raised eyebrows. But there was a deeper meaning behind it. The match was arranged with help from Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and many saw it as more than romance. It was a symbolic link between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, between the Arab world and the rest of the continent. It was Nkrumah saying, "We're one people." Back in 1958, before Ghana even became a one-party state, Nkrumah hosted a major event, the All-African People's Conference. It was a massive gathering, with about 300 representatives from across the continent. They came from student unions, trade groups, and political parties, some of them young, hungry, and ready to fight for their country's freedom. The point of the meeting was simple: get everyone on the same page. Colonialism had to go, and Africa needed to stand together to make that happen. Big names showed up, people who would later lead their countries, like Julius Nyerere from Tanganyika, which would later become Tanzania, Kenneth Kaunda from Northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and Joshua Nkomo from what was then Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Even a young, sharp-minded activist from Kenya named Tom Mboya was chosen to chair the whole thing. Nkrumah took this conference seriously. It was step one in his long-term plan to turn Africa into a unified, powerful federation, with one economy, one political voice, and shared goals. But not everyone was on board. Many African leaders liked Nkrumah's ideas in theory, but when it came to giving up power in their own countries, not so much. They wanted cooperation, not full-on unity. So instead of creating the United States of Africa, they settled on something less intense, a group called the Organization of African Unity, formed in 1963. Still, Nkrumah was right there at the center of it, helping shape what would become Africa's most important diplomatic body at the time. There was one event, though, that really pushed Nkrumah to double down on his unity dream: the Congo crisis. In 1960, Congo had just gained independence from Belgium, but instead of peace, the country fell into chaos. Foreign armies jumped in, leaders clashed, and soon, the country's first elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, was arrested and later killed. Nkrumah was devastated. Lumumba was more than a fellow leader. He was a friend and a symbol of everything Africa's freedom stood for. In late 1963, Nkrumah stood before a room full of African journalists in Accra and didn't hold back. He pointed to the Congo and painted a harsh picture. A country being drained dry by greedy outsiders, big companies from the US and Belgium, who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. To Nkrumah, it wasn't just about politics, it was about control. He believed African countries had thrown off their colonial rulers, only to be quietly controlled in new ways. The death of his friend Patrice Lumumba in the Congo hit him hard. Lumumba had been Congo's first elected leader and was full of promise, until he was taken out in a brutal, messy power struggle that many said had foreign fingerprints all over it. After that, Nkrumah's mission became crystal clear. The fight wasn't just against colonialism, it was against neo-colonialism, a new kind of control that looked softer, but was just as dangerous. By 1965, Nkrumah had put all of his thoughts into a book that pulled no punches. It was called Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, and it wasn't just a book, it was a firebomb. In it, he argued that African countries might be free on paper, but their economies were still being run by outsiders. Giant corporations, foreign banks, and governments from the West were still calling the shots, just without waving flags or wearing uniforms. The book named names. It criticised countries like the US and Britain, accusing them of keeping Africa poor and dependent on purpose. You can probably guess how that went over. The Western powers were not amused. In fact, they were furious. The US, which had been sending money and support to Ghana for years, started backing off. Aid was cut. Promises disappeared. And Ghana, already feeling the pressure from huge development projects and growing national debt, started to wobble. Back home, many Ghanaians were frustrated. While Nkrumah was busy speaking at conferences and dreaming of a united Africa, their everyday lives were getting harder. Prices were rising, jobs were harder to find, and now the help from the West had dried up. By 1965, things were really falling apart. The government was running out of money, and Ghana was deep in a financial hole. To try and fix it, Nkrumah's team introduced tough cutbacks, less spending, higher prices, fewer imports. The people weren't happy. These new policies hit hard, especially for the poor. Meanwhile, in quiet corners of Ghana's military and police, some people were having secret conversations. According to later reports, folks in Washington already knew what was coming. A memo from inside the US government actually said a pro-Western coup might be on the way. One official even wrote that some of the people plotting the coup were keeping the US in the loop. He said, "We're not the ones pulling the strings directly, but we've made this situation easier by ignoring Nkrumah's requests for help." By early 1966, Ghana was flat broke. So when news came on February 24th that the army had taken control, very few were shocked. At 6 a.m., a voice crackled over the radio. It was Colonel E.K. Kotoka. His message was simple: the Nkrumah era is over. At the time, Nkrumah was nowhere near Ghana. He was in China, on his way to Vietnam, hoping to help stop the war over there. But back home, things were already moving fast. The coup itself was quick and mostly without bloodshed, though there were clashes at Flagstaff House, the presidential residence, where Nkrumah's elite guards tried to fight back. A few were killed, including General Barwa, who refused to surrender and was shot during the chaos. After the dust settled from the 1966 coup, a group of men in uniform stepped forward to explain why they had kicked Nkrumah out of power. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were some of the top dogs in Ghana's military and police. Colonel E.K. Kotoka, Major Akwasi Afrifa, Lieutenant General J.A. Ankra, and Police Inspector General Harley all said the same thing. Ghana needed saving. According to them, Nkrumah's government had become way too powerful, way too greedy, and way too controlling. They said the president had turned his party, the CPP, into something that no longer listened to the people. Elections didn't really mean anything anymore, and voices of opposition had been silenced. They also didn't like how obsessed Nkrumah was with African politics. He wanted Ghana to lead freedom movements all over the continent, even suggesting that Ghanaian soldiers might one day go fight in other countries' wars for independence. Though in reality that never actually happened. Still, the idea didn't sit well with some of the military men at home. They said the soldiers were tired, underappreciated, and left out of the big decisions. So when they finally took over, they called their movement a national rescue. Colonel Kotoka even claimed they had liberated the country from what he described as a one-man rule. Once in charge, the new rulers gave themselves a name: the National Liberation Council, or NLC for short. They wasted no time. Nkrumah's political party was dissolved, his programs were rolled back, and the entire direction of the country shifted almost overnight. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Nkrumah was in China on a peace mission when everything fell apart. At first, the Chinese welcomed him, treating him like the important leader he had once been. But soon after, he got an invitation he couldn't refuse from his old friend, President Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea. Touré didn't just offer Nkrumah a place to stay, he gave him the title of Honorary Co-President of Guinea. It was more symbolic than anything, but it showed deep respect. Nkrumah moved to Conakry, the capital, and made it his new home. He didn't fade into the background, though. Even in exile, Nkrumah kept writing, thinking, and reaching out to other African leaders. He poured his thoughts onto paper, especially in a book called Dark Days in Ghana, where he explained how he believed the coup had been planned, and pointed fingers at Western intelligence, especially the CIA, for playing a secret role in his downfall. But time was not on his side. In the early 1970s, his health started to slide. Doctors discovered he had prostate cancer, and by April 27th, 1972, while in Bucharest, Romania, Kwame Nkrumah passed away. He was 62. His body was first buried in Guinea, the country that had taken him in when no one else would. But eventually Ghana brought him home, to Nkroful, the small village where his story began. Years later, something changed. The same country that once turned its back on him began to take another look. Little by little, people began to speak of him, not just as a fallen leader, but as the man who had led them to freedom. Ghana built a grand mausoleum in his honour right in Accra. His name was taught in schools, his face put on currency, and his place in history restored, as the founding father who dared to dream beyond borders. If you found this video interesting and insightful, be sure to hit that like button and don't forget to